Hello and welcome. Today, we'll take a quiet journey back in time, exploring how the United States shaped its election system and the significant moments that changed it forever. From the very first election, when George Washington became the first president, to the modern, complex election cycles we see today, America's electoral history is full of fascinating stories. It wasn't always as it is now. There was a time when only a small part of the population could vote, and political parties didn't even exist. Over the centuries, new voices joined the voting process, from women to minorities, each expanding the idea of democracy. There have been moments of great triumph, but also controversies and bitter battles that tested the strength of the nation. In this series, we'll look at how the Founding Fathers imagined elections, the rise of political parties, the impact of civil rights movements, and the elections that changed the course of history. It's a story of growth, struggle, and the ongoing quest for a truly representative democracy. So, let's begin with where it all started, the first presidential election in 1789. The Founding Fathers and the first elections, 1789. The first U.S. presidential election, held in 1789, marked a turning point for the newly formed republic. It was the first time the constitutional framework would be put to the test, as the country moved from the chaos of revolution to the structured system of a democratic government. At the heart of this historic moment was the unanimous selection of George Washington, a leader admired across the nation for his role in the Revolutionary War and his steady hand in uniting the fledgling country. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation had proven ineffective at governing the states. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, provided a more robust federal system, and a key component of that system was the election of a president. The Founding Fathers debated extensively over how this leader should be chosen. Some argued for a direct popular vote, while others feared this would lead to unqualified candidates swaying the masses. The result was the creation of the Electoral College, a compromise that allowed states to select electors, who would then vote for the president. This first election was quite different from those we see today. Political parties had not yet formed, and the idea of campaigning as we know it did not exist. In fact, Washington did not even seek the presidency. He was seen as the natural choice, and he accepted the position out of a sense of duty to his country. The electors cast their votes in February 1789, with Washington receiving all 69 electoral votes, making him the only president in U.S. history to be unanimously elected. John Adams received the second highest number of votes, becoming the nation's first vice president. Washington's inauguration on April 30th, 1789, in New York City was a monumental event. Standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, Washington took the oath of office, setting the stage for the office of the presidency. His humility and concern for the nation's future were evident in his inaugural speech, in which he expressed both his gratitude and the heavy weight of responsibility that came with the position. At this time, only a small portion of the population, mostly white, male property owners, had the right to vote. Electors were chosen by state legislatures, meaning that much of the general population had little to no direct involvement in selecting the president. This limited electorate reflected the early republic's cautious approach to democracy, rooted in concerns about the potential for mob rule or uninformed decision-making. Over time, this would change as voting rights expanded and the electorate grew more diverse. But in 1789, the system reflected the elitist nature of early American politics. The Electoral College, designed as a middle ground between direct popular vote and congressional selection, was intended to ensure that only the most qualified individuals were chosen to lead the nation. Although it worked smoothly in Washington's case, the system would soon face challenges as political parties emerged and elections became more competitive. In the coming years, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans would clash over the direction of the country, and the once clear path to the presidency would become far more complicated. Washington's presidency set numerous precedents that shaped the office for generations to come. One of his most important decisions was the creation of a cabinet composed of trusted advisors to help him govern the nation. He selected Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, two men with vastly different views on how the country should develop. Their ideological differences would eventually lead to the formation of America's first political parties, with Hamilton heading the Federalists and Jefferson the Democratic Republicans. Although Washington's election was free from the bitter partisanship that would later define American politics, his time in office revealed the deep divisions that were beginning to form within the new government. The debates over the power of the federal government, the role of states, and foreign policy would dominate the political landscape, leading to the rise of factions that would evolve into formal political parties. Washington's presidency is also notable for his decision to step down after 2 terms, a move that set a lasting precedent for peaceful transitions of power. His refusal to serve indefinitely quelled fears that the presidency could become a form of monarchy. By voluntarily relinquishing power, Washington solidified the democratic principles that the new republic was founded upon. The election of 1789 was a simple and unanimous process, but it laid the groundwork for the complex and often contentious elections that would follow. As the nation grew, so too did the electorate, and the once clear consensus around Washington's leadership gave way to fierce political rivalries. The evolution of the electoral process over the next few decades would reflect America's ongoing struggle to define democracy and balance power between its citizens and their government. The rise of political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. In the early days of the United States, the Founding Fathers hoped to avoid the divisive influence of political parties. George Washington warned of the dangers of factions in his farewell address, fearing they would weaken the new republic. Despite these concerns, the 1790s saw the rise of 2 opposing political groups, the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. At the heart of these divisions was a fundamental disagreement about how the country should be governed. The Federalists believed in a strong central government, which they saw as essential for maintaining order and stability. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, laid out his vision for a modern, industrialized nation driven by a centralized financial system. His plan included the creation of a national bank, assuming state debts, and promoting commerce. Hamilton's policies were aimed at strengthening the federal government and fostering economic growth, particularly in manufacturing and trade. The Federalists were supported by merchants, bankers, and business owners, particularly in the Northeast. They favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which allowed for a more flexible use of federal powers to address the nation's needs. Their vision for the country was modeled on Great Britain, a nation they viewed as stable and prosperous. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans advocated for a decentralized government where power remained with the states. Thomas Jefferson believed the future of America lay in its agrarian roots, with small, independent farmers forming the backbone of society. He feared that a strong federal government, particularly one with a national bank, would become corrupt and threaten the rights of the people. Jefferson's strict interpretation of the Constitution emphasized limited federal authority, with most powers reserved for the states. The Democratic Republicans drew their support from farmers and landowners in the South and West. They were suspicious of urban elites and viewed the Federalists' push for a national bank as an attempt to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. In foreign policy, they favored closer ties with France, especially after the French Revolution, which they saw as a continuation of the fight for Republican ideals. The Jay Treaty of 1794, which sought to resolve post-revolutionary tensions between the United States and Great Britain, deepened the divide between the two parties. While the Federalists supported the treaty as a way to avoid war and maintain trade relations, the Democratic Republicans saw it as a betrayal of American values and a capitulation to British interests. This ideological split came to the forefront in the election of 1796, the first contested presidential race in U.S. history. John Adams, representing the Federalists, narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic-Republican candidate. The election showcased the growing regional and political divisions within the country, with Adams drawing support from the North and Jefferson from the South. During Adams' presidency, tensions between the two parties escalated. The passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, designed to suppress dissent and limit the influence of immigrants who tended to support the Democratic Republicans, was seen by Jefferson and his allies as an assault on civil liberties. In response, Jefferson and Madison drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which introduced the idea of nullification, the notion that states could invalidate federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The election of 1800 was a turning point in American politics. Jefferson defeated Adams in what became known as the Revolution of 1800, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in U.S. history. This election not only solidified the role of political parties in American democracy but also underscored the resilience of the country's democratic institutions. The Federalists, once dominant, began to fade as a political force after Jefferson's victory. By 1816, the party had largely dissolved, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the primary political power for the next several decades. However, the debates between these two parties over the role of the federal government, states' rights, and the direction of the country continued to influence American politics for generations. The 1824 election, the corrupt bargain. The election of 1824 remains one of the most controversial in U.S. history, signaling the end of the era of good feelings and introducing new political divisions. Although Andrew Jackson won both the popular vote and the most electoral votes, he did not secure the required majority, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. The outcome led to accusations of a corrupt bargain that would haunt American politics for years. By 1824, the Federalist Party had collapsed, leaving the Democratic-Republican Party as the sole political entity. However, this unity was only on the surface, as internal factions had developed. The election was contested by four major candidates, each representing different visions for the country. Andrew Jackson, the war hero from Tennessee, who appealed to the common man and had strong support in the South and West. John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, who represented the interests of the Northeast and advocated for federal investment in infrastructure. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House from Kentucky, who championed his American system, focusing on tariffs and national development. William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury from Georgia, supported by the pro-states' rights faction. The election of 1824 was unique because it was the first where a significant portion of the electorate could vote directly for their candidate, thanks to the expansion of white male suffrage. However, the Electoral College still had the final say in determining the presidency. When the electoral votes were tallied, Jackson received 99, Adams 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. Since no candidate had secured the majority, the decision fell to the House of Representatives under the rules of the 12th Amendment. As Speaker of the House, Henry Clay wielded significant influence even though he had been eliminated from the race. Clay disliked Jackson and shared many of Adams' views on national development, leading him to throw his support behind Adams. In February 1825, the House voted to elect Adams as the 6th President of the United States. Shortly after his victory, Adams appointed Clay as Secretary of State, a move that immediately sparked accusations of a corrupt bargain. Jackson's supporters were furious, claiming that the democratic process had been subverted. The term corrupt bargain became a rallying cry for those who believed Jackson had been unjustly denied the presidency. Jackson himself, angered by the result, vowed to run again in 1828, building a formidable political base in the process. Adams' presidency was defined by bitter opposition from Jacksonian Democrats, who viewed his administration as illegitimate. Adams' plans for federal investment in infrastructure and education were largely blocked in Congress, where Jackson's allies held significant power. His presidency became synonymous with political gridlock, as the nation became increasingly polarized between Jackson's populist supporters and Adams' more traditional backers. The election of 1824 also underscored growing sectional tensions in the United States. Jackson's support came primarily from the West and South, regions that felt neglected by the federal government. These voters were drawn to Jackson's populist message of reform, government accountability, and resistance to elite control. Meanwhile, Adams found strong backing among urban and educated voters in the Northeast, who favored his vision of federal investment and national modernization. In the years following the election, the political landscape of the United States began to shift dramatically. Jackson's defeat, despite his widespread popularity, spurred the development of a more organized opposition to Adams' administration. His supporters coalesced into what would later become the Democratic Party, positioning themselves as defenders of the common man against what they saw as the corrupt, elitist policies of Adams and his allies. On the other side, Adams and his supporters, including Henry Clay, would go on to form the National Republican Party, which advocated for a stronger federal government, protective tariffs, and economic development through infrastructure improvements. This party would eventually evolve into the Whig Party, which became a major force in American politics during the 1830s and 1840s. The 1828 election marked a dramatic reversal of fortune for Adams. Jackson, having spent 4 years building his political machine, defeated Adams in a landslide, capitalizing on the lingering resentment from the 1824 election and his image as a man of the people. The 1828 election also introduced a new era of American politics, with mass rallies, parades, and a focus on appealing directly to the electorate. Jackson's victory in 1828 was a testament to his ability to mobilize public support and harness the frustrations of ordinary Americans. In retrospect, the election of 1824 was more than just a battle between 4 candidates. It was a reflection of the broader social and political changes happening in the United States. The controversy over the corrupt bargain highlighted the growing dissatisfaction with the established political order and the demand for a more inclusive and democratic process. This election laid the groundwork for the rise of Andrew Jackson as one of the most influential figures in American political history, setting the stage for the emergence of a new era in American democracy. The election of Abraham Lincoln, 1860, a nation divided. The election of 1860 was one of the most significant and transformative in American history, serving as the immediate precursor to the Civil War. The nation was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, and the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th president marked a turning point that would ultimately lead to the secession of Southern states and the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. By the late 1850s, the United States was sharply divided along sectional lines. The primary source of this division was the expansion of slavery into new territories. While northern states opposed the spread of slavery, many southern states viewed it as essential to their economic system and way of life. Efforts to address the issue through compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, had only temporarily alleviated tensions. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, in which the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could not be U.S. citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories, further inflamed the national debate. The election of 1860 saw the emergence of four major candidates, each representing different sections of the country and different views on slavery. Abraham Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories but promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Stephen A. Douglas, the candidate of the Northern Democrats, supported the doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in each territory to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. John C. Breckinridge, representing the Southern Democrats, advocated for the protection of slavery in all territories, reflecting the views of the South's pro-slavery faction. John Bell, the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, sought to preserve the Union above all else and avoided taking a strong stance on slavery. The Democratic Party, which had been the dominant political force for decades, was deeply fractured over the issue of slavery. The split between Northern and Southern Democrats made it virtually impossible for the party to present a unified front. Lincoln, representing a party that had been founded in opposition to the expansion of slavery, emerged as the clear choice for many Northern voters, though he was virtually unknown in the South. When the votes were tallied, Lincoln won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, securing 180 electoral votes. However, his victory came with only about 40% of the popular vote, as the other candidates split the remaining votes. Lincoln won almost all of the northern states, while Breckinridge carried most of the South. Douglas won just one state, while Bell carried 3 border states. Most significantly, Lincoln did not win a single electoral vote from any southern state. His victory was purely a reflection of Northern support, highlighting the deep sectional divide within the country. Lincoln's election was met with immediate outrage in the southern states. Although Lincoln had repeatedly assured the nation that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life. Many in the South believed that Lincoln's presidency would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery, which they viewed as essential to their economic system and social order. In response to Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. In the months that followed, 6 more southern states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. These states justified their secession by arguing that Lincoln's presidency was a direct threat to their rights and that they had the right to leave the Union to preserve their way of life. Outgoing President James Buchanan took little action to stop the secession, leaving the crisis for Lincoln to address when he assumed office in March 1861. The election of 1860 was not just a political contest, it was a reflection of the deep divisions that had been building in the United States for decades. The North and South had developed into two distinct societies, with fundamentally different views on the institution of slavery, the role of the federal government, and the future of the Union. Lincoln's election crystallized these divisions, pushing the nation toward a conflict that had seemed inevitable for years. When Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, he faced the greatest challenge any American president had ever encountered: the secession of the Southern states and the looming threat of civil war. In his inaugural address, Lincoln appealed to the South to remain in the Union, stating that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. He also made it clear that the Union was perpetual and that he would not allow the dissolution of the United States. However, his appeals for unity fell on deaf ears. In April 1861, the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina marked the beginning of the Civil War. Over the next 4 years, the war would claim over 600,000 lives and fundamentally reshape the nation. Lincoln's election and the subsequent secession of Southern states exposed the deep fault lines in American society. The issue of slavery, which had long been a source of tension, had finally reached a breaking point, and the result was a conflict that would determine the future of the United States. The election of 1860 was a pivotal moment in American history. It was the first time a president had been elected solely on the strength of Northern support, without any backing from the South. The Gilded Age elections, money, power, and politics, 1870 to 1900. The Gilded Age in American history, spanning roughly from the 1870s to the 1900s, was a period marked by rapid industrialization, economic growth, and significant social inequality. It was also a time when political corruption and the influence of big money on elections reached new heights. The elections of the Gilded Age were often dominated by powerful political machines, wealthy industrialists, and special interest groups, shaping the outcome of elections through financial power and influence. During this era, the United States transformed from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. With the rise of big industries such as steel, railroads, and oil, a new class of wealthy business magnates emerged, including figures like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. These men, often referred to as robber barons, accumulated vast fortunes and wielded significant political influence. Their wealth gave them the power to shape not only the economy but also the political landscape. The political system during the Gilded Age was highly susceptible to corruption. Political machines, most notably Tammany Hall in New York City, controlled local elections through patronage, bribery, and the manipulation of votes. These machines were able to maintain their power by providing services to immigrants and the working class in exchange for political loyalty. Boss Tweed, the notorious leader of Tammany Hall, epitomized the corrupt practices of the era. His control over New York politics was so vast that he was able to steal millions of dollars from the city treasury while ensuring that his candidates won elections. At the national level, political parties were closely aligned with business interests, particularly the Republican Party, which had strong support from industrialists and bankers. The Republican platform during this period favored high tariffs, which protected American industries from foreign competition, and a gold-based currency, which benefited creditors and the wealthy. The Democratic Party, while less connected to big business, was often divided between northern and southern factions, with the South still recovering from the Civil War and grappling with the consequences of Reconstruction. Elections during the Gilded Age were characterized by close contests and high voter turnout. Despite the corruption, or perhaps because of it, politics during this period was highly competitive. Voter participation rates were some of the highest in American history, often exceeding 80%. This was largely due to the intense loyalty that many Americans felt toward their political parties. The issues of the day, tariffs, currency reform, and the role of government in regulating the economy, were fiercely debated, and both parties worked hard to mobilize their supporters. One of the most significant elections of the Gilded Age was the 1876 presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, and Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat. This election was one of the most disputed in U.S. history, with allegations of voter fraud and intimidation on both sides. Tilden won the popular vote, but the results in several southern states were contested. A special electoral commission was created to resolve the issue, and after weeks of negotiation, Hayes was declared the winner in what became known as the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the presidency, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and allowing the rise of Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South. The role of money in politics became even more pronounced as industrialists sought to protect their interests. Campaign finance was largely unregulated, allowing business leaders to funnel vast amounts of money into the coffers of their preferred candidates. One of the most notorious examples of this influence was the election of 1896, which pitted William McKinley, the Republican candidate, against William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic and Populist Party candidate. McKinley's campaign, led by industrialist Mark Hanna, set new records for fundraising, with Hanna raising millions from business leaders who feared Bryan's call for the free coinage of silver and his attacks on the gold standard. McKinley's campaign was a turning point in the use of money in politics. Hanna's strategy involved using business leaders to pressure their employees to vote for McKinley, warning that a Bryan victory would lead to economic ruin. The election also highlighted the growing divide between urban and rural America, as McKinley's support came from industrialists, bankers, and urban workers, while Bryan drew his strength from farmers in the rural Midwest and South. McKinley's victory in 1896 cemented the Republican Party's dominance in national politics for the next several decades and solidified the gold standard as the foundation of U.S. monetary policy. The Gilded Age also saw the beginnings of the progressive movement, which sought to address the corruption and inequality that had become rampant during this period. Reformers like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson would later challenge the power of big business and push for greater government regulation of industries, but during the Gilded Age itself, reform was slow to come. The political system remained dominated by money interests, and the influence of corporations on elections continued to grow. Despite the rampant corruption and inequality, the Gilded Age elections were a critical period in shaping modern American politics. The issues of this era, campaign finance, the role of big business in politics, and the tension between urban and rural voters, remain relevant today. The elections of this period set the stage for the political reforms of the Progressive Era and the eventual push for greater regulation of campaign finance and corporate influence in politics. The suffrage movement, Women's Fight for the Vote, 1920. The women's suffrage movement in the United States was one of the most significant and transformative social movements in American history, culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. This hard-won victory was the result of decades of tireless activism, organizing, and campaigning by generations of women who fought against social norms, political opposition, and entrenched gender roles. The roots of the suffrage movement can be traced back to the early 19th century. During this time, women were largely excluded from the political process and had few legal rights. They were often considered the property of their husbands, with little control over their own finances, education, or legal standing. However, as the abolitionist movement gained momentum in the 1830s and 1840s, many women became involved in the fight to end slavery, which in turn sparked their own desire for equal rights. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, is often cited as the official beginning of the women's rights movement. At this historic gathering in Seneca Falls, New York, attendees drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which outlined the grievances women faced in society and called for the right to vote, among other demands. The Declaration was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, asserting that all men and women are created equal. This bold declaration set the stage for a long and difficult struggle for women's suffrage. The fight for women's voting rights was met with fierce opposition. Many men, and even some women, believed that a woman's place was in the home and that participation in politics would corrupt her moral purity. Opponents of suffrage argued that women were too emotional or uneducated to make informed political decisions. Additionally, many believed that giving women the right to vote would upset the traditional balance of power in society, particularly in terms of family dynamics and the role of women in the household. Despite these challenges, suffragists pressed on. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Alice Paul emerged as powerful voices in the movement. Anthony, one of the most prominent figures, dedicated her life to the cause of women's rights, traveling the country, giving speeches, and organizing rallies to gain support for the suffrage movement. In 1872, she famously attempted to vote in the presidential election, arguing that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., implicitly gave women the right to vote. She was arrested and fined for her actions, but her defiant stand brought national attention to the cause. The movement continued to grow in strength through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, founded in 1890 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, became the leading organization advocating for women's voting rights. NAWSA used a combination of lobbying, public demonstrations, and legal challenges to push for suffrage on a state-by-state basis. Their strategy was to win the vote in individual states first, and then use these victories to build momentum for a national amendment to the Constitution. The early 20th century saw a new wave of suffragists, who were often more militant in their tactics. Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, NWP, adopted more confrontational methods, such as picketing the White House, organizing hunger strikes, and staging massive public demonstrations. These efforts were often met with violence and arrests. Paul and other suffragists were imprisoned for their protests, and many faced brutal treatment while in jail. Despite these hardships, their persistence paid off. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created a new context for the suffrage movement. As men went off to fight, women took on new roles in factories, offices, and other sectors traditionally dominated by men. This shift in gender roles strengthened the argument for women's suffrage, as women proved that they were capable of handling responsibilities outside of the home. Women's contributions to the war effort highlighted the hypocrisy of denying them the right to vote while they were serving their country in essential ways. By 1918, public sentiment had begun to shift in favor of women's suffrage. President Woodrow Wilson, who had previously been lukewarm on the issue, publicly endorsed the suffrage amendment, recognizing the role women had played during the war. The 19th Amendment, which prohibited any U.S. citizen from being denied the right to vote on the basis of sex, was passed by Congress in 1919 and sent to the states for ratification. After a fierce battle, the amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, with Tennessee becoming the 36th state to approve it, providing the necessary 3/4 majority. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a monumental victory for the women's suffrage movement, but it did not end the struggle for equal voting rights. Many African American women, particularly in the South, continued to face discrimination and voter suppression through Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests. While the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in theory, in practice, women of color often found themselves excluded from the political process for decades to come. It would not be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that many of these barriers were dismantled. Nevertheless, the success of the suffrage movement was a major milestone in the fight for gender equality and laid the foundation for future advances in women's rights. The ability to vote empowered women to have a say in the laws and policies that affected their lives, from labor rights to reproductive health to education. The New Deal and the 1932 election, Franklin D. Roosevelt's victory amid crisis. The 1932 election took place in the depths of the Great Depression, marking a pivotal moment in American history. The election saw Franklin D. Roosevelt rise to power, promising a new deal to address the unprecedented economic crisis. Roosevelt's victory not only transformed the political landscape but also led to sweeping reforms that reshaped the role of the federal government in American life. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. By 1932, nearly 1/4 of the American workforce was unemployed, banks were collapsing, and countless families were losing their homes. The economic downturn had caused widespread despair, and many people lost confidence in the government's ability to restore stability. President Herbert Hoover, the incumbent Republican candidate, struggled to manage the crisis. Hoover believed in limited government intervention, arguing that the economy would naturally recover. While he did introduce measures such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, to aid banks and businesses, his response was largely seen as inadequate. As unemployment skyrocketed and economic conditions worsened, Hoover became a symbol of government failure. Hoovervilles, makeshift shanty towns named derisively after him, sprang up across the country as millions found themselves homeless. In stark contrast stood Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York. Roosevelt's message of hope and his promise of a New Deal resonated with the electorate. While initially vague about the specifics, Roosevelt's optimism and his willingness to take bold action offered a refreshing alternative to Hoover's cautious approach. Roosevelt's experience as governor, where he implemented progressive policies to provide relief to the unemployed, made him a credible candidate during such a time of crisis. Roosevelt's victory in 1932 was overwhelming. He won 57.4% of the popular vote, while Hoover secured only 39.7%. In the Electoral College, the results were even more dramatic, with Roosevelt winning 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. This election marked the end of Republican dominance in national politics and a shift toward greater government intervention in the economy. Once in office, Roosevelt wasted no time. During his first 100 days, he launched an ambitious legislative agenda known as the New Deal, aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform. His administration introduced a series of programs designed to stabilize the economy, restore confidence in the financial system, and provide immediate help to the millions suffering from unemployment and poverty. One of Roosevelt's first acts as president was to address the banking crisis. Shortly after taking office, he declared a bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks to prevent further withdrawals. The move allowed Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Act, which helped restore public confidence in the banking system. When the banks reopened, deposits far exceeded withdrawals, signaling the success of Roosevelt's strategy. The New Deal also introduced several landmark programs aimed at providing jobs and stimulating economic growth. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work on environmental conservation projects, while the Public Works Administration, PWA, funded large-scale infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, and dams. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was another critical New Deal initiative, providing jobs while bringing electricity and modern infrastructure to one of the poorest regions of the country. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, was another major component of the New Deal, designed to stabilize agricultural prices by reducing surplus production. Farmers were paid to reduce their output, which helped to raise prices and provided much-needed relief to struggling agricultural communities. Though controversial, the AAA was seen as a necessary step to bring stability to the farming sector. While the New Deal helped alleviate some of the worst effects of the Depression, it was not without its critics. Conservatives argued that Roosevelt's policies represented government overreach and warned that they would harm the free market. Business leaders were particularly vocal in their opposition, accusing Roosevelt of moving the country towards socialism. On the other hand, some progressives, including Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, argued that the New Deal did not go far enough in redistributing wealth and addressing inequality. By 1935, Roosevelt introduced the Second New Deal, expanding upon the initial relief efforts. One of the most significant pieces of legislation from this period was the creation of Social Security, which provided pensions for the elderly and unemployment insurance for those out of work. The Wagner Act also strengthened labor unions by protecting workers' rights to organize and engage in collective bargaining. Despite opposition, Roosevelt remained popular with the American people. His use of fireside chats, radio broadcasts where he explained his policies directly to the public, helped build trust and confidence in his leadership. Roosevelt's ability to communicate with ordinary Americans, combined with his willingness to experiment with new policies, made him a highly effective leader during this critical period. The 1932 election marked a turning point in American political life. It represented a shift away from the laissez-faire policies that had dominated the 1920s and toward a new vision of government as a tool for economic stability and social welfare. Roosevelt's New Deal redefined the relationship between the federal government and its citizens, laying the groundwork for future reforms that continue to shape American society today. In retrospect, Roosevelt's election and the New Deal fundamentally transformed the role of the American presidency and the expectations of government. The Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 election, Lyndon B. Johnson's landslide victory. The 1964 election was a defining moment in American history, not only because of Lyndon B. Johnson's overwhelming victory but also because of its deep connection to the civil rights movement. Johnson, who had become president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, positioned himself as a champion of civil rights, pushing forward groundbreaking legislation that would change the course of American society. At the heart of the 1964 election was the struggle for racial equality. The civil rights movement, which had gained momentum during the 1950s and early 1960s, sought to end segregation, discrimination, and racial injustice, particularly in the southern states. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other activists fought tirelessly to challenge the oppressive Jim Crow laws that had kept African Americans marginalized for generations. The movement reached a critical point in the early 1960s, with peaceful protests, sit-ins, and marches drawing national attention to the plight of African Americans in the South. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, helped galvanize public support for the cause of civil rights. In the wake of Kennedy's assassination, Johnson used his political skill and influence to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. This legislation outlawed segregation in public places, banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and opened the door to greater federal enforcement of civil rights. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was a major victory for the movement, but it also triggered a backlash, particularly in the South, where many white voters felt that their way of life was under attack. The political landscape of the 1964 election reflected the growing divide in the nation over civil rights. Johnson's opponent, Barry Goldwater, a staunchly conservative senator from Arizona, opposed the Civil Rights Act, arguing that it represented federal overreach into states' rights. Goldwater's campaign focused on a platform of limited government, individual freedom, and a strong stance against communism. However, his opposition to civil rights legislation alienated many voters outside of the South, particularly African Americans and liberal Democrats. Goldwater's position on civil rights was emblematic of a broader shift within the Republican Party, which increasingly aligned itself with conservative white voters in the South, marking the beginning of the Southern strategy that would define the party for decades to come. While Goldwater was personally not a segregationist, his opposition to the Civil Rights Act made him a symbol of resistance to racial integration, drawing support from white Southerners but isolating him from much of the rest of the country. Johnson, by contrast, embraced civil rights as a central part of his campaign. He ran on the promise of building a great society that would tackle poverty, racial injustice, and inequality. Johnson's vision extended beyond civil rights to include programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and federal aid to education, which aimed to create a more equitable society. His commitment to using the power of the federal government to address social issues stood in stark contrast to Goldwater's limited government philosophy. The election of 1964 was not just a referendum on civil rights, it was also a test of the broader direction in which the country was headed. Johnson's landslide victory, in which he won over 61% of the popular vote and carried 44 states, was one of the most decisive in American history. Goldwater, on the other hand, won only 6 states, 5 of them in the Deep South, plus his home state of Arizona. This dramatic result highlighted the growing isolation of Southern conservatism from the rest of the nation. Johnson's success in 1964 solidified the Democratic Party's role as the party of civil rights and social reform. African American voters, who had traditionally supported the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, shifted decisively to the Democratic Party in response to Johnson's support for civil rights. This realignment of African American voters and the solidification of the South as a Republican stronghold marked a significant transformation in American political dynamics. The aftermath of the election saw Johnson continue to push for civil rights reforms. In 1965, he signed the Voting Rights Act, which sought to eliminate barriers to African American enfranchisement, particularly in the South. The act banned literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices that had long prevented black citizens from voting. The Voting Rights Act was another major victory for the civil rights movement and helped ensure that African Americans could exercise their right to vote freely for the first time since Reconstruction. Johnson's presidency, however, was not without its challenges. While he achieved significant progress in civil rights and social reform, his escalation of the Vietnam War would eventually undermine his popularity and lead to deep divisions within the Democratic Party. The war, which grew increasingly unpopular as American casualties mounted, overshadowed much of Johnson's domestic agenda and contributed to his decision not to seek re-election in 1968. Nonetheless, the 1964 election and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were landmark achievements that helped transform the United States. They laid the foundation for future advances in racial equality and social justice and marked a decisive moment in the fight against segregation and discrimination. The 1964 election is remembered not only for Johnson's landslide victory but also for the broader social changes it symbolized. The 2008 election, Barack Obama's historic victory. The 2008 election was a watershed moment in American history, marking the election of Barack Obama as the first African American president of the United States. His victory, amid an economic crisis and 2 ongoing wars, signaled a moment of hope and change for many Americans. It also represented a shift in the political landscape, with Obama's message of unity and optimism inspiring a diverse coalition of voters. Obama's path to the presidency was nothing short of remarkable. A relatively unknown senator from Illinois, he first gained national attention with his keynote speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, where he delivered a message of hope, unity, and the idea that there were no red states or blue states, only the United States of America. This speech catapulted Obama into the national spotlight and laid the foundation for his presidential run just 4 years later. The 2008 election took place against the backdrop of the Great Recession, the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. The financial crisis, which began in 2007, had led to the collapse of major financial institutions, skyrocketing unemployment, and the foreclosure of millions of homes. Americans were deeply concerned about the state of the economy, and the outgoing administration of George W. Bush faced widespread criticism for its handling of the crisis. In this context, Obama's message of change we can believe in resonated with voters who were looking for a new direction. His campaign emphasized the need for economic reform, healthcare expansion, and an end to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama's calm demeanor, eloquence, and promise to restore hope to the nation stood in stark contrast to the more traditional political figures of the time. Obama faced Hillary Clinton, a formidable opponent, in the Democratic primary. Clinton, a senator from New York and former First Lady, was widely seen as the frontrunner. However, Obama's grassroots campaign, powered by young voters, progressives, and minority communities, helped him overcome Clinton's initial lead. The Democratic primary battle was long and hard-fought, but Obama ultimately secured the nomination, and Clinton later endorsed him, urging her supporters to rally behind the party's candidate. On the Republican side, John McCain, a senator from Arizona and a war hero from the Vietnam War, emerged as the party's nominee. McCain, known for his independent streak and willingness to reach across the aisle, faced the challenge of distancing himself from the unpopular Bush administration while maintaining support from the Republican base. McCain chose Sarah Palin, the governor of Alaska, as his running mate in an effort to energize conservative voters. Palin, a relative newcomer to national politics, was initially seen as a bold choice but later became a controversial figure due to her inexperience and polarizing rhetoric. The 2008 campaign was historic not only because of Obama's candidacy but also because of the way it was run. Obama's team revolutionized modern campaigning by leveraging social media, data analytics, and grassroots organizing to reach voters in ways that had never been done before. His campaign utilized platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to mobilize supporters, raise funds, and spread his message. The Obama for America organization raised unprecedented amounts of money, much of it in small donations from ordinary Americans, allowing the campaign to outspend its rivals significantly. One of the defining moments of the general election campaign came during the financial crisis of September 2008, when Lehman Brothers, one of the nation's largest investment banks, collapsed. The crisis intensified voter concerns about the economy, and Obama's calm, measured response helped solidify his image as a steady leader in a time of turmoil. McCain, by contrast, struggled to address the crisis, and his decision to temporarily suspend his campaign to focus on the crisis was seen by some as erratic. Throughout the campaign, Obama emphasized his vision for change, particularly in areas like healthcare reform, economic recovery, and foreign policy. He pledged to pass a sweeping healthcare reform bill, which would later become the Affordable Care Act, and to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan responsibly. McCain, on the other hand, focused on his experience, his commitment to reducing government spending, and his strong national security credentials. On November 4, 2008, Obama won a decisive victory, capturing 53% of the popular vote to McCain's 45% and securing 365 electoral votes to McCain's 173. Obama's victory was particularly notable for the diverse coalition of voters he brought together, including African Americans, young people, women, and Hispanics, many of whom turned out in record numbers. His victory in traditionally Republican states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Indiana demonstrated the broad appeal of his message of change. Obama's election was celebrated around the world as a historic moment for American democracy. In his victory speech in Chicago, Obama addressed the significance of the moment, stating, "If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, tonight is your answer." His election represented a new chapter in the long struggle for racial equality in the United States, coming 143 years after the end of the Civil War and 45 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. However, Obama's election also exposed deep divisions within the country. While his supporters saw his victory as a sign of progress, many conservatives viewed his policies as too liberal, particularly his plans for healthcare reform and government spending. The 2008 election marked the beginning of a new era in American politics, with rising partisan polarization that would continue to shape the political landscape in the years to come. The 2020 election, a divisive and historic contest. The 2020 election was one of the most contentious and consequential in American history. Amid a global pandemic, economic turmoil, and intense political polarization, the contest between Donald Trump, the incumbent Republican president, and Joe Biden, the Democratic challenger and former vice president, became a referendum on the future of the country. With record-breaking voter turnout, a highly charged political atmosphere, and claims of election fraud, the 2020 election left a lasting impact on the American political landscape. At the center of the election was the COVID-19 pandemic, which had upended life in the United States and around the world. By the fall of 2020, millions of Americans had contracted the virus, and hundreds of thousands had died. The pandemic caused widespread economic disruption, with businesses closing, unemployment soaring, and millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet. The handling of the pandemic became a central issue in the election, with Trump's response facing heavy criticism from Democrats and public health experts who argued that his administration had not done enough to control the virus or support struggling families. Trump's approach to the pandemic, characterized by downplaying the severity of the virus and promoting rapid reopening of the economy, appealed to his conservative base but alienated many moderates and independents. Biden, by contrast, promised to take the virus seriously, pledging to listen to scientists, increase testing, and implement a national strategy to bring the pandemic under control. His message of leadership and competence resonated with voters who were frustrated with the administration's response to the crisis. Another key issue in the election was the widespread social unrest that had erupted following the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in May 2020. The incident sparked massive protests across the country, with millions of Americans taking to the streets to demand racial justice and police reform. The movement, known as Black Lives Matter, became a focal point of the national conversation. Trump positioned himself as a law and order candidate, condemning the protests and accusing Democrats of supporting violence and chaos. Biden, while supporting peaceful protests, called for systemic reforms to address racial inequality. The 2020 election was also defined by unprecedented levels of voter engagement and turnout. Fueled by the intensity of the issues at stake, both campaigns mobilized millions of voters. Biden's campaign focused on expanding mail-in voting options due to the pandemic, while Trump repeatedly claimed that mail-in voting would lead to widespread fraud, despite little evidence to support this claim. As a result, the election became deeply polarized, with each side accusing the other of undermining the democratic process. On November 3, 2020, Americans cast their votes, but it would take several days for the final results to be determined due to the large number of mail-in ballots. Biden ultimately won the election with 306 electoral votes to Trump's 232, and secured 51.3% of the popular vote compared to Trump's 46.8%. Biden's victory was built on key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, many of which had narrowly voted for Trump in 2016. Biden's campaign also saw strong support from African Americans, suburban voters, and younger generations. Despite Biden's clear victory, Trump refused to concede, claiming without evidence that the election had been stolen through widespread fraud. His legal team filed numerous lawsuits challenging the results in several states, but these efforts were overwhelmingly dismissed by courts. The refusal to accept the election results culminated in the shocking events of January 6, 2021, when a mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the certification of Biden's victory. This unprecedented attack on American democracy further deepened the political divide and led to Trump's second impeachment by the House of Representatives. The 2020 election, while historic in its turnout, and the election of Kamala Harris as the first female vice president and the first woman of color to hold the office, also exposed the fragility of American democracy. The post-election period was marked by deep distrust between the two major parties and ongoing debates about election integrity and voter suppression. Biden's victory signaled a shift in priorities, with his administration focusing on combating the pandemic, addressing climate change, and pursuing racial and economic justice. However, the divisiveness of the election and the events of January 6 underscored the challenges of governing a deeply polarized nation. Biden's call for unity and healing contrasted sharply with the realities of a divided electorate, where many of Trump's supporters continued to believe in conspiracy theories about the election's legitimacy. Looking back, the 2020 election will be remembered not only for its high stakes and record-breaking voter turnout, but also for its role in revealing the deep political, social, and cultural divides in the United States. It was an election that tested the strength of democratic institutions and highlighted the ongoing struggle for political and social stability in an increasingly polarized nation. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more relaxing and informative content. I always appreciate your support and love reading your comments, so feel free to share your thoughts below. Until next time, take care and stay well.